A middle school teacher? My father said, loud enough to carry over the clink of silverware and the lazy hum of conversation drifting across the backyard. He was standing at the head of the long anniversary table, with one hand wrapped around a crystal glass and the other resting on the back of my mother's chair, like he owned not just the house, but every breath inside it. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that always looked polished from a distance and rotten up close. That's not a career. That's daycare with homework. The entire table went still. 52 people had come to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, and in one sentence, my father turned the whole evening into a public execution. The string lights over the patio glowed warm against the Georgia dusk. Someone's fork slipped and tapped a plate. Ice shifted softly in a glass of sweet tea. Beyond the fence, cicadas screamed from the trees like they were trying to drown out what had just been said. But nothing could drown it out. Not really. My 6-year-old son, Noah, was sitting 2 chairs down from my husband, swinging his legs beneath his seat, and I watched the confusion spread over his little face as he looked from his grandfather to his father, trying to understand why a room full of grown adults had suddenly forgotten how to act human. My husband, Evan, didn't say a word. That was the part that hurt the most. Not because I wanted him to fight back, not because I needed him to defend himself, but because I knew that stillness in him. I knew what it cost. He set his fork down with careful precision, folded his napkin once, and placed it beside his plate as if my father had merely commented on the weather. Then he lifted his eyes and looked at Harold Brooks the way a man looks at a storm he knew was coming hours before the first thunder cracked. Calm, tired, not surprised. And in that quiet, with my father still standing there basking in his own cruelty, I realized something awful. This wasn't just a jab. This wasn't a tasteless joke. He had been waiting for this moment all evening. I'm Elena Brooks. I'm 34 years old. I'm a physical therapist in Macon, Georgia, and for 3 years I have been married to the gentlest, steadiest man I have ever known. Evan teaches 8th grade history at a public middle school. He spends his weekends coaching debate students who can't afford private programs, buying pizza for kids who stay after school because home is worse than detention, and grading papers at our kitchen table with a mug of coffee that always goes cold before he remembers to drink it. He is the kind of man who notices when a child at the grocery store drops a toy and kneels to hand it back before the mother even turns around. The kind of man who never raises his voice unless someone is in danger. The kind of man my father has hated from the first day he realized I loved him more than I feared the Brooks family opinion. Across the table, my mother lowered her eyes to her plate. Marianne had spent the entire afternoon gliding through the party in a navy dress and pearl earrings, smiling too hard, checking the catered platters, telling everyone how blessed she felt to have both daughters under one roof again. But now, she said nothing. My sister, Rachel, froze with her wineglass halfway to her lips. Pastor Raymond cleared his throat and stared down at his brisket, like scripture might be hidden in the barbecue sauce. Aunt Colleen pressed her mouth into a tight line that looked suspiciously close to satisfaction. And Luke Mercer, handsome, wealthy, carefully invited. Luke Mercer leaned back in his chair and swirled his bourbon, pretending not to notice that my father had just carved my husband open in front of half the town. Noah's voice broke the silence. "Mom," he asked, small and clear, "why is Grandpa making fun of Dad?" Something inside me cracked. My father had insulted Evan before. He'd done it in private, in side comments, in loaded questions about salary and ambition, and real futures. 3 years ago, when I told him I was marrying Evan, whether he approved or not, he told me I was choosing struggle on purpose. He said I was throwing my life away on a man who would never be able to give me what I deserved. I married Evan anyway. For a while, that choice cost me my family. So when my mother called a month ago, crying and saying time had softened everyone, saying Noah deserved grandparents, saying Dad wasn't the same man anymore, I let myself believe her. I drove back into this house with hope folded so carefully inside me I barely dared touch it. Now I sat at that decorated anniversary table, staring at the centerpieces, the gold candles, the catered china, the faces of relatives and neighbors pretending not to hear what had just been said, and I understood how stupid hope could make a woman. Because humiliating my husband was one thing, humiliating him in front of my child was something else entirely. And whether anyone else at that table wanted to admit it or not, my father had just crossed a line he could never uncross. I should have answered Noah the second he asked the question. Instead, for one long, shameful beat, nobody said anything. My mother finally reached for her glass, but she still didn't speak. My father stood at the head of that anniversary table like he had done nothing wrong, one hand still around his drink, his face wearing that same polished expression he used whenever he wanted cruelty to pass for confidence. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he said with a short laugh. "We're just talking." That was how Harold Brooks always did it. He said something vicious, then spread the blame around the room until it sounded harmless. Like humiliation became acceptable if enough people sat there and swallowed it. I felt my whole body go hot. But before I could speak, Evan pushed his chair back and stood. He didn't move fast. He didn't look angry. He just reached down and rested his hand on Noah's shoulder. "Come on, buddy," he said quietly. "Let's go look for fireflies." Noah slid off his chair at once, still confused, still glancing back at me. But he took his father's hand. Evan led him away from the table, across the patio, and toward the darker edge of the yard, where the string lights faded into the trees. He did not defend himself. He did not give my father the fight he wanted. And somehow, that made the whole thing worse. My father hadn't attacked a man who would swing back. He had attacked a man who cared more about protecting his son than protecting his pride. I stood up so fast my chair scraped hard against the patio stone. "That wasn't a joke," I said. My father turned slowly, irritation settling over his face. "Elena, sit down." "No." The word came out, clear and flat. Small, but final. Rachel looked up. Even Luke Mercer stopped pretending not to listen. For a second, my father just stared at me, like he couldn't quite believe I had said it in front of witnesses. "I said sit down," he repeated. And I said no. My hands were shaking, but my voice held. "You do not get to talk to my husband like that. Not here, not anywhere." His mouth tightened. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about stability. You may not like the delivery, but somebody has to tell the truth." There it was. The old script. In his mind, he was never cruel, only honest. Never controlling, only concerned. It was the same lie he had used 3 years earlier when he told me marrying Evan would ruin my future. I looked around at the decorated tables, the catered food, the gold candles, the relatives and church friends all pretending this was still an anniversary party and not a public shaming, and something cold settled inside me. I had seen this pattern before. Different setting, same knife. Then I looked past everyone else and saw Evan near the fence, bent slightly toward Noah, pointing at tiny flickers rising from the grass. My son had already forgotten the table for the moment. Evan was making sure he could. That was when the truth hit me with full force. None of this had happened by accident. And just like that, I was back to the phone call that had brought me there. A month earlier, I had been kneeling on the bathroom floor in Macon, rinsing shampoo out of Noah's hair, while he twisted around and splashed water onto my shirt. My phone buzzed on the counter. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the screen. Mom. Just that. No picture, no little heart, no softness. I had kept her number for emergencies only. Death, hospital, something final, not this. But I answered anyway. "Elena," my mother said, and she was already crying. "Please don't hang up." I closed my eyes for a second. Noah was still laughing in the tub, completely unaware that one word from that voice could pull me backward years. "What happened?" I asked. "Nothing bad," she said too quickly. No, Nothing like that. I miss you. Your father misses you too. I almost laughed at that. My father had not called me once in 3 years. Not on my birthday. Not when Noah was born. Not when we bought our house. Silence had been his punishment, and he had carried it out like a sentence. We're having our 40th anniversary dinner next month, my mother went on. Family, a few friends, people from church. And I just keep thinking, Noah is getting older. He deserves to know where he comes from. There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. A child used as a bridge back into a house that had once slammed shut on me. And the worst part was that she knew exactly where to press. Because, for all the anger I still carried, Noah had never met his grandparents. He didn't know the smell of my mother's perfume or the sound of her laugh before it turned nervous. He didn't know that my father used to carry me on his shoulders through the county fair before I got old enough to disappoint him. Your dad has changed, she whispered. He's older now. Softer. Please, Elena, just come for one night. I should have known better. But when a mother cries like that, some part of you still wants to believe home might have grown kinder while you were gone. That was the part of me my mother reached through the phone and found. Not the woman I had become in Macon, with a job, a husband, and enough hard-earned sense to recognize guilt when I heard it. The daughter. The one who still remembered lavender perfume on Sunday mornings, cornbread cooling on the stove, and a time when my father's hand had felt like safety instead of judgment. I didn't say yes that night. I let several days pass before I called her back. In those days, I turned it over from every angle, usually late at night after Noah was asleep and the house had gone quiet. I wanted my son to have more family. I wanted to believe time had softened something in my parents, even if it hadn't healed it. But more than that, I wanted to know whether I was protecting peace or just protecting an old wound. When I finally told Evan my mother had invited us, he was at the kitchen table with a stack of student essays spread in front of him. He took off his glasses and set his pen down before I had even finished the sentence. She says, "Dad's changed," I told him. She says, "Noah deserves to know them." He was silent for a second, not hesitant, just careful. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me does. Part of me thinks that's exactly why I shouldn't." He nodded. "Then if we go with our eyes open." That was all. No pressure, no wounded pride, no speech about what my father had already done to him. He never made me choose between loving him and grieving what I had lost. Maybe that was exactly why my father had never known what to do with him. When I called my mother back, she cried again, softer this time, and then moved straight to logistics, as if the tears had only been there to open the door. Dinner would be Saturday evening. Some relatives. A few family friends from church. Nothing big, she promised. Just warm, just intimate, just a chance to begin again. By the time the anniversary weekend arrived, I had repeated those words to myself so many times they had started to sound almost believable. We drove down from Macon that Saturday afternoon, Noah in the back seat asking whether grandparents looked different from regular old people. The farther south we went, the flatter the roads seemed to get, and by the time we turned onto my parents' street, dusk had settled over the neighborhood in that soft southern way that made everything look gentler than it really was. The house was exactly as I remembered it. Red brick, white shutters, crepe myrtles lining the walkway, clipped into neat obedience. For one strange second, it felt less like coming home, and more like walking back into a photograph someone else had preserved. My mother came out before we were fully parked. She moved faster than I expected, and when I stepped from the car, she wrapped both arms around me and held on too long. She smelled like powder and lavender. For one second, my body remembered her before my mind did. Then I saw my father standing in the doorway. He didn't come down the steps. He just stood there in a pressed button-down and dark slacks, watching us with that same straight-backed stillness I had grown up reading like weather. He looked older, yes, more gray at the temples, but not softer. His eyes went to me first, then Evan, Then Noah, quick and assessing. "Well," he said, "you made it." That was all. No apology, no welcome home. Just the acknowledgement of a man receiving guests he believed had arrived on his terms. Evan came around the car and offered his hand first. "Good to see you, sir." My father shook it briefly, like courtesy was all he intended to spend on him. Then, Noah climbed out, clutching his stuffed dinosaur, and the whole moment shifted. My mother's face softened for real. Even my father bent slightly and rearranged himself into something almost grandfatherly. "So this is Noah," he said. Noah looked at me before moving, and I gave him a small nod. My father crouched and held out a hand. "I'm Grandpa Harold." Noah took it because he was 6 and still believed adults meant what they said. My father smiled at him in a way he had not smiled at either me or my husband. Watching that sweetness appear exactly where it would do the most work made something in me go still. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and roast beef. Fresh flowers sat in the dining room. Everything looked staged within an inch of perfection. And then I saw the table. It had been expanded with extra leaves, set for far more people than the few my mother had mentioned over the phone. Near the center, beside the chair clearly meant for me, sat a folded cream name card resting against the china. I couldn't see the name yet, but I knew a setup when I saw one. I didn't need to read the name on the card to feel the trap closing. The whole house had that same tight feeling I remembered from childhood, the kind that meant somebody was about to be corrected, and everyone already knew who it would be except the person walking into it. My mother was moving around the dining room too quickly, straightening serving spoons, smoothing the tablecloth, asking Noah whether he wanted lemonade in a voice so bright it sounded forced. From the living room, I could hear my father talking to Evan in that flat, measured tone he used whenever he wanted a conversation to feel polite, while he searched for the weak spot underneath it. I turned the cream card over. Luke Mercer. For a second, I just stared at it and felt nothing at all. Then the meaning hit. Of course it was Luke. The man my father used to bring up whenever he wanted to remind me what he thought success looked like. Polished, connected, the kind of man who wore confidence like a tailored jacket and had never once walked into a room wondering whether he belonged there. Luke had always been more symbol than person in my father's mind. Not Elena's friend. Not even really a potential partner. Just proof that there were men in the world Harold Brooks considered acceptable, and that my husband, in his view, had never been one of them. My mother appeared beside me almost instantly, like she had been waiting for the exact moment I turned the card over. "Isn't the table lovely?" she asked. I held up the place card between 2 fingers. "You told me this was a few relatives and some church friends. Luke's family has known us for years." "That's not what I asked." Her eyes flicked toward the living room and back to me. "Elena," she said softly, still smiling. "Please don't start." There it was. In my mother's version of every family disaster, the real problem was never what had been arranged behind closed doors. It was the moment someone named it out loud. I set the card back against the china with more care than it deserved. "When were you planning to tell me he'd be here?" "It's just dinner." "No," I said. "A church friend dropping by is just dinner. Seating me next to the man Dad tried to handpick for me for years is not just dinner." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the serving tray she was holding. For 1 second, I thought she might deny it. Instead, she said the quiet part aloud. "Luke's done very well for himself." I let out a breath through my nose and looked away before I said something sharp enough to cut us both. Through the doorway, I could see into the living room. My father stood with one hand in his pocket, talking to Evan, as if they were equals sharing small talk, instead of 2 men standing on opposite sides of a judgment he had never let go of. Noah was on the rug at their feet, pushing his dinosaur across the hardwood floor, making soft, growling sounds, perfectly unaware that the adults around him were already trying to rearrange his family into something easier for my father to respect. Before my mother could say anything else, the side door opened. Rachel came in carrying a white bakery box tied with red string, and the second she saw my face, she stopped. She looked from me to the place card, and then toward our mother. And in that one quick glance, I knew two things at once. She already knew Luke was coming, and she had hoped I wouldn't find out this early. "What happened?" she asked, though her voice was too careful to be real. I picked up the card again and held it where she could see it. "You tell me." Rachel set the bakery box down on the counter and glanced toward the living room before stepping closer. At 38, she still moved through this house like someone who had been trained to take up as little space as possible. "Dad insisted," she whispered. "I told Mom it was a bad idea." "How bad?" She swallowed. "He wanted Luke beside you. He said it would be clarifying." The word landed in me like ice. Clarifying. As if my marriage were a confusion that needed sorting out. As if humiliating my husband in his own presence could be dressed up as concern. To my father, humiliation and honesty had always been cousins. If he could seat me between the life I had chosen and the life he believed I should regret not choosing, he would call that truth instead of cruelty and expect everyone else to nod along. I looked at Rachel. "And you both just let him do it?" Her face tightened. "You know how he gets." Yes, I did know how he got. That was the problem. Everybody knew. Everybody adjusted. Everybody ducked. And somehow, his temper always became the reason everyone else had to become smaller. From the living room, my father's voice rose just enough to carry. "Luke should be here any minute," he said. I turned toward the sound, my heart suddenly beating in a hard, steady rhythm. And just like that, the trap stopped being a suspicion and became a countdown. I should have told Evan everything right then. I should have taken Noah, gone back to the car, and left my parents to celebrate their anniversary with their candles, their polished silver, and whatever version of family loyalty made this seem acceptable to them. But I stayed. Some part of me still wanted proof so clean I would never again be tempted to call myself dramatic for seeing exactly what was in front of me. So, I walked into the living room with my face arranged into something calm. My father looked up first. "Everything all right in there?" "Fine," I said, the oldest lie I knew how to tell. Evan glanced at me once, and I knew he didn't believe me. But he didn't call it out in front of my father. He just held my gaze for half a second, steady and quiet, like he was leaving the door open for me to speak when I was ready. Then, the doorbell rang. My mother startled so hard she nearly dropped the stack of appetizer plates in her hands. My father's whole face changed. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was satisfaction wearing good manners. He crossed the room and opened the front door with more eagerness than he had shown his own son-in-law. "Luke," he said. "Good to see you." Luke Mercer stepped inside, carrying a bottle of red wine and a small gift bag, dressed in a navy blazer over an open-collar white shirt, polished enough to look expensive without trying. He looked exactly the way I remembered him, composed, confident, and entirely at ease with being admired. "Mr. Brooks." He smiled and shook my father's hand. "Happy anniversary." "That's very kind of you," my mother said quickly, relief spilling into her voice as she took the bag from him. Then Luke saw me. "Elena," he said. "It's been a long time." "It has. How've you been?" "Good," I said. "Busy." He smiled. "Same here." His eyes shifted to Evan then, and for one brief second I saw it that quick, assessing glance people give when they're trying to understand the room they've just walked into. Not hostility, not surprise, just calculation. My father stepped in before the silence could settle on its own. "Luke, this is Evan," he said. Then, after the slightest pause, "Elena's husband." The beat between those two words was small enough that a stranger might have missed it. I didn't. Neither did Evan. Still, he extended his hand first. "Good to meet you," he said. Luke shook it. "You too." That should have been enough. But my father never let silence stay harmless for long. "Luke's just opened another office in Alpharetta," he said, like the subject had wandered there by accident. "Commercial real estate. He's doing very well for himself. Luke gave a modest smile. Business has been good. Then my father turned to Evan. And you're still teaching, right? There it was. The first real move. Evan nodded once. 8th grade history. My father made a soft sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. Middle school. That takes patience. It does, Evan said. That was all. No apology in his tone. No defensiveness either. Just a fact. Luke shifted slightly, still holding the wine bottle, and for the first time since he had walked in, he looked less comfortable. Good. Let him feel a little of the strain that had been built into this room long before he arrived. My mother clapped her hands once, too brightly. Let's all sit down before dinner gets cold. We moved toward the dining room in a slow cluster of forced ease. Noah ran ahead to his seat, talking to Rachel about whether dinosaurs would have liked roast beef. Rachel laughed softly, but she kept her eyes down. My father guided Luke toward the chair beside mine, without appearing to guide him at all, one hand lightly touching the back of a seat, one glance in the right direction, one tiny adjustment to make it all seem natural. And when Evan moved to take the seat on my other side, Harold stepped back and looked over the table with the quiet satisfaction of a man seeing his plan take shape exactly as he had imagined it. I sat down between the man I had married and the man my father had once wanted for me. This had never been a reunion. It was a comparison, and dinner had only just started. The first few minutes passed in brittle politeness. My mother kept asking Noah if he wanted more potatoes, in a voice too cheerful to be real. Rachel busied herself with serving spoons no one needed. Beside me, Evan thanked my mother for dinner as calmly as if this were an ordinary Saturday meal instead of a trap dressed up in china and candlelight. My father waited until everyone had food on their plates before he began. "So, Luke," he said, carving into the roast beef, "how many people are you managing these days?" Luke swallowed, dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and answered with the smooth modesty of a man used to making success sound accidental. "Across all 3 offices? About 80. My father let out a low whistle. 80 by 39. That takes vision." Luke gave a polite smile. "I've been lucky. Luck helps," my father said. "But discipline matters more." Pastor Raymond nodded into his iced tea. My mother kept her eyes fixed on the serving dishes. Then, my father turned to Evan. "And you're still at the same school, right?" Evan cut a bite of roast beef before answering. "Yes, sir. Middle school history," my father said, as if testing the weight of the phrase and finding it light. "That's a hard age." "It can be," Evan said. "But they're good kids." My father gave a short smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure they are. I just don't know many men who'd call that enough." The table quieted, but not fully. Silverware still moved. Ice still shifted in glasses. That was the worst part about moments like these. The world did not stop for humiliation. It just made room for it. Luke cleared his throat and tried for humor. "Honestly, I barely survived middle school myself." A few people laughed. It might have saved the moment with a different man, but Harold Brooks had no interest in saving anything he could use. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "it's a very different kind of ambition." Rachel's fork stalled halfway to her mouth. Noah looked up from his plate. I could feel the air changing around the table, turning thinner, sharper, like a room before lightning finds it. My father rested one arm along the back of his chair and looked directly at Evan. "No offense," he said, which in my family had always meant offense was exactly what was coming. "But I've never understood why a man would stay in a job that tops out before life really starts costing money." So that was where he had been heading all along. Evan set down his fork. Not hard, not in anger, just enough to show he had stopped pretending this was normal. My father's eyebrows lifted slightly. "No? No, sir." For one second, I thought maybe that would be enough. Evan had answered him plainly, calmly. He had given him an opening to stop before this got uglier. But my father had not built this evening for restraint. He had built it for witness. I'm just saying, he went on, waving one hand as if we were discussing weather and not my husband's worth. A family takes more than ideals. Kids get older, expenses get bigger. At some point, being a nice man isn't the same thing as being able to provide. The words landed in the center of the table, like something dropped and breakable. Before I could speak, Noah turned to his father, then to my grandfather, his small face serious in the way children get when they know something important is happening even if they don't understand all of it. "Dad provides," he said. Every sound at that table seemed to fall away. My 6-year-old had said the one thing every adult there should have said first. Evan looked at Noah, not my father. His whole face softened. "It's okay, buddy," he said quietly. But it wasn't okay. Not even close. My father heard his grandson defend his father and still chose cruelty. "Sure," he said, in a manner of speaking. I felt my hand tighten around my fork. Then he looked straight at Evan and said the line he had probably been saving all evening. The line that would split this dinner cleanly into before and after. "A middle school teacher," he said. "That's not a career. That's daycare with homework." The words hit the table and seemed to stay there, heavy and ugly, like something no one wanted to touch but everyone could smell. No one laughed this time. Not Luke. Not Pastor Raymond. Not even Aunt Colleen, who usually treated other people's discomfort like background music. My mother froze with the serving spoon halfway over the green beans, her mouth parted just slightly, as if even she hadn't expected my father to make his cruelty that plain. But she still didn't stop him. She never did. In my family, a line could be crossed in front of a room full of people, and as long as no one formally acknowledged it, the injured person was expected to sit there politely and keep eating. Noah looked from my father to Evan, his little face tight with confusion. "Dad," he asked softly, "what does that mean?" That was it. That was the moment something in me stopped trying to get through the evening and started preparing to end it. But Evan moved first. He folded his napkin once and set it beside his plate. Then he turned to Noah, not to my father, not to the rest of the table, just to our son. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and steady, the same voice he used when Noah woke up, scared in the middle of the night, or scraped a knee badly enough to cry. "It means Grandpa said something unkind," he said. "And that's not your fault, buddy." The silence that followed was complete. My mother made a small sound in her throat. "Evan," she whispered, like he was the one making this inappropriate. My father gave a short laugh and leaned back in his chair. "Now hold on," he said. "If we're going to be that sensitive." "Sensitive?" I said. My chair scraped the floor as I stood. I didn't even remember deciding to do it. "You just insulted my husband in front of my son." My father turned toward me with the same look he had used my entire childhood when he wanted to remind me that public obedience mattered more than private truth. "Elena," he said, low and warning, "lower your voice." "No." The word came out clean. "No," I said again. "You do not get to talk to him like that. Not in front of Noah. Not ever." My mother finally set down the serving spoon. "Please," she said, glancing around the table instead of at the man who had caused this. "Let's not make a scene." In my family, the reaction had always been treated as the real offense. "A scene was made the second he said it," I told her. "I'm just the first person willing to say so." Pastor Raymond looked down at his plate. Rachel's eyes filled, but she still didn't speak. Luke opened his mouth like he might step in, then thought better of it. No one at that table chose courage. Evan did. He stood up slowly and rested one hand on Noah's shoulder. "Come on, buddy," he said. "Let's get some air." Noah slid from his chair at once and moved close against his father's side. Evan's hand shifted lightly to the back of his neck, protective and easy, like it belonged there. The sight of that small gesture hurt more than the insult itself. My father had spent the whole evening trying to make him look lesser, and still Evan was the only man in that room acting like strength had anything to do with kindness. As they started toward the back door, My father called after him. "No offense, son, but in this family, men build things." Evan stopped with his hand on the door. The whole table held its breath. Then, he turned just enough to look back. Not angry, not shaken, just done. "A family isn't something you own, Harold." No one moved. Evan opened the door, and the cool night air slipped into the room. Noah went out first. Evan followed, closing the door gently behind them, and just like that, my father was left at the head of a table full of people too weak to tell him what he had just become. My father was left at the head of a table full of people too weak to tell him what he had just become. I stood there for one more second, looking at every lowered face around that table, every careful silence, every person pretending this had somehow gone wrong on its own, instead of being led here step by step. Then I pushed my chair back and went after my husband. The night air was cool and damp against my skin. Evan was standing near the edge of the yard with Noah tucked close beside him, fireflies blinking low over the grass like small signals in the dark. Noah looked up the second he saw me. "Are we leaving?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Not later, not maybe." "Yes." Evan searched my face for half a second, and whatever he saw there made him nod once. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't tell me what to do. He just accepted the answer I should have given hours ago. By the time I stepped back into the dining room, every face had turned toward the door. The house felt quieter now, like everyone had been listening for the sound of us leaving and heard only my footsteps come back. My mother took one quick step toward me. "Elena, please, don't leave like this." I looked at her and felt something inside me go cold. "You don't get to ask for peace after standing there and helping him do this." Her mouth trembled. I didn't know he was going to say that. "Maybe not those exact words," I said. "But you knew what tonight was." She didn't answer. That was answer enough. My father pushed his chair back and stood. The certainty had gone out of him now. In its place was that harder look I knew from years ago, the one that always came when control started slipping, and he needed to make someone else pay for noticing. "You're overreacting," he said. I turned toward him. "You invited Luke to sit beside me. You spent the entire night comparing my husband to him like I was supposed to be ashamed of the man I married. And then you said that in front of Noah." Harold's jaw tightened. I told the truth. "No," I said. "You showed everyone what you value." That landed. I saw it in the way his face changed for one sharp second. Not remorse, never remorse, just the sting of being seen clearly in front of witnesses. Rachel covered her mouth with one hand. Luke stared down at the tablecloth. Pastor Raymond suddenly found the far wall fascinating. No one rushed in to save my father. That, more than anything, was new. "I think you should leave," Harold said. I almost laughed. "We already are." I went upstairs without waiting for another word. The staircase creaked under my feet the way it had when I was 16, and somehow that made the whole house feel smaller, not safer. My overnight bag was still on the bed in my old room, half unzipped. Noah's dinosaur pajamas were folded on the chair, waiting for a bedtime that was not happening in this house. I shoved everything into the bag too fast, my hands shaking now that I finally had somewhere to put the anger. Then I saw Evan's satchel on the floor near the dresser. It had tipped onto its side, and a large cream envelope was sticking out of the top. Thick, official, stamped with the seal of the Bibb County Board of Education. The same envelope I had seen in Macon. I picked it up before I could stop myself. When I came back downstairs, my mother was crying quietly into a napkin. My father had sat down again, rigid and silent, as if he thought stillness could restore dignity once it had left the room. I didn't say anything more. There was nothing left in that house worth saying. Outside, Evan was buckling Noah into the back seat. I held up the envelope. "What's in this?" For the first time all night, something unreadable passed across his face. "Not here," he said quietly. "I'll tell you once Noah's settled." I got into the passenger seat without another word. We drove in silence, the kind that comes after something breaks and nobody has the strength to name all the pieces yet. Noah went quiet in the back after a few minutes, clutching his dinosaur against his chest. About 10 minutes later, I told Evan to pull into the first motel with a vacancy sign glowing red in the window. I didn't want Noah half asleep in the back seat while the last pieces of the night came apart. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning spray. We got Noah changed and tucked under a stiff floral blanket, the television turned low enough to blur into background noise. He was asleep in minutes, one hand still curled around the dinosaur's tail. I stood by the window with the envelope in my hand while Evan sat on the edge of the bed watching me. "There's a reason I asked you to stay until Monday," he said. Then, he nodded toward the envelope. "Open it." I pulled the letter from the envelope with fingers that suddenly didn't feel steady. The paper was thick, formal, the kind that made the words look official before I had even finished reading them. My eyes went straight to the heading, Bibb County Educator of the Year. For a second, I just stared. Then I read it again, and again. The room around me seemed to go strangely still, like the motel walls had stepped back to make room for what was in my hands. Evan sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, watching me with that same quiet steadiness he had carried through the entire night. But now there was something more cautious in it, like he was waiting to see whether this would make things better or only heavier. I looked down at the letter again. His name was there in clean black print. Evan Carter. Recognition. Excellence. Selection Committee. Ceremony on Monday afternoon at the Macon Civic Auditorium. Family invited. Reception to follow. My throat tightened. "You knew," I said. "You knew all weekend." He exhaled through his nose. "For about 3 weeks. 3 weeks." I looked up at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" He didn't answer right away. He never did when the truth mattered. He would rather sit in silence for a second than say the easy thing too fast. "Because I didn't want this turning into a reply to your father," he said at last. "And I didn't want you thinking I needed this to prove I was worth defending." I just stood there, holding the letter. All night my father had treated him like a man who needed to justify his place in our family. And all along, Evan had been carrying around something that could have shut Harold up in front of every person at that table. He could have told me before we left Macon. He could have pulled that letter out the first time my father started comparing him to Luke Mercer. He didn't. Not because he had nothing to say, because he refused to let my father decide what this meant. I sat down slowly in the chair by the window, the paper trembling a little in my hand now. "Educator of the Year," I said, almost under my breath. "Evan," he gave the smallest shrug. "It's county level." I let out one short laugh that came out closer to a broken breath. "Only you would say that like someone handed you a parking voucher." That made the corner of his mouth move for half a second. "My principal nominated me," he said. "A few parents wrote letters. Some former students did too." "Former students?" He nodded. "Principal Dawson said there'd be a few people speaking." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I could see him exactly as he was at home. Red pen in one hand, coffee gone cold beside him, still showing up for kids other people had already overlooked. My father had spent the whole night measuring him by money and image and public status. He had never once considered that a man could matter more in people's lives than he ever would in a room like his. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "after Noah was settled. After we were out of there." I looked back at the letter. "You wanted to stay until Monday because of this." "Yes." "And you were still going to go after tonight?" He held my eyes. "Yes," he said. "Because whatever your father thinks, this isn't about him. It never was." That hit me harder than anything else. Not because it was noble. Not because it sounded good. Because it was true. My father had built his whole life around being the center of every room he entered, and Evan had somehow refused to orbit him, even when he was being humiliated right in front of him. He had held on to the real meaning of the night ahead, while the rest of us were still drowning in the ugliness of the one behind us. I pressed my hand against my mouth and felt my eyes sting. Then Evan leaned forward a little, lowering his voice so he wouldn't wake Noah. "There's one more thing," he said. I looked at him. "Rachel texted while you were packing," he said. "She thinks your dad overheard enough to know I've got somewhere to be Monday." The letter shifted in my hand. "What do you mean, overheard enough?" "He doesn't know what it is," Evan said. "But he knows I didn't want to leave town tonight," Rachel said. "He started asking questions as soon as you went upstairs." I felt my whole body go still. Not because I was surprised Harold wanted control back. That part was obvious. But because I knew him. If he sensed there was something he didn't know, something important, something that might happen without his approval, something that might reveal he had judged the wrong man in front of the wrong audience, he would come. And if he came, he wouldn't come to celebrate. He would come to win back the version of himself that had cracked at that dinner table. For the first time since we left my parents' house, I stopped feeling like the night was over. It wasn't. It had only changed locations. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face at the dinner table, heard Noah's small voice asking what it meant, felt the weight of the letter in my hands all over again. By 7, we were up, dressed, and back on the road home to Macon, with motel coffee and paper cups, and Noah half asleep in the back seat, his dinosaur tucked under one arm. The drive felt shorter than it should have. I kept turning the envelope over in my lap, tracing the raised seal with my thumb like it might disappear if I stopped touching it. Evan drove with both hands on the wheel, quiet and steady. Whatever else he felt, he had already made room for it. We stopped at home just long enough to shower and change. Evan put on a white button-down and the navy tie I'd bought him at an outlet mall 2 Christmases ago. He tightened it in the hallway mirror, gave the knot one small adjustment, and looked at his reflection the way he looked at everything else that mattered with focus, not vanity. Noah wore khakis and a blue polo. I put on the green dress I usually saved for Easter and interviews. At 11:30, Evan's phone rang. "Dawson," he said, putting it on speaker as he buttoned his cuffs. Principal Dawson's voice came through bright and hurried. "Just checking in. We're packed already. Auditorium's fuller than I expected." Evan glanced at me in the mirror. "That full?" Dawson laughed. "Parents, teachers, district people, former students, some local press. You know how these things go once word gets around. And your speakers are here." Speakers. Even after reading it in the letter, that part still didn't feel real. When we pulled into the Macon Civic Auditorium parking lot an hour later, the first thing I noticed was how many cars were already there. Rows of them, heat shimmering above the pavement. Parents carrying folded programs. Teachers in pressed slacks and sensible heels. Teenagers in shirts they had clearly been told to tuck in. It didn't feel like a small county ceremony. It felt like a room the town had decided mattered. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of old carpet, coffee, and perfume. A banner near the entrance read Bibb County Educator of the Year in gold lettering. We had barely stepped inside before someone from district staff approached with a clipboard and a relieved smile. "Mr. Carter? We're so glad you made it." Then a man I didn't know, maybe a parent, crossed toward Evan, shook his hand, and said, "My daughter had you in 8th grade. She still talks about your class." It happened so quickly I could only stand there and watch. The same man my father had dismissed as daycare with homework was barely 10 feet inside the building, and already people were greeting him like he mattered here. Not politely, not out of obligation, like his name had weight in their lives. Noah tugged on my hand. "Yeah," I said, my throat tightening. "They do." Principal Dawson came toward us fast, a program tucked under one arm, wearing the tired, warm expression of a man who had spent years in public schools and still believed in them. "Evan," he said, gripping his hand. "Good, you're here." Then he turned to me and Noah. "You must be Elena, and you," he said, crouching slightly, "must be the famous son I've heard about." Noah pressed shyly against my side, and Dawson smiled before straightening. "We're just about to start seating. Front sections reserved for family." Family. The word landed differently now. As we followed him toward the auditorium doors, The room opened in front of us, row by row, beneath warm stage lights. Teachers, students, parents, men in district jackets, women holding cameras, people flipping through programs with Evan's name printed inside. The whole place felt bigger than anything my father could control. Then, 3 rows back on the left, I saw them, my mother first, and Harold beside her, in the same dark slacks from the night before, stiff-backed and unsmiling. He had come. And for the first time in my life, my father was going to have to sit still, while a room he didn't control decided what kind of man my husband was. The auditorium lights dimmed a few minutes later, and a low hush moved through the crowd like a curtain being drawn. Programs stopped rustling. Conversations folded in on themselves. Noah shifted in his seat beside me, suddenly still, in the way children get when they sense the adults around them are stepping into something important. On stage, the podium stood beneath a wash of warm light, the county seal mounted on the front, the banner behind it catching gold at the edges. A woman from the district stepped up first to welcome everyone, her voice practiced and bright, but I barely heard her. I was too aware of Evan beside me, sitting with his hands loosely clasped, shoulders straight. Expression calm, in that same way it had been calm at my parents' table the night before. But here it landed differently. At my father's house, his quiet had been treated like weakness. In this room, it looked like what it really was: self-command. After the opening remarks, Principal Dawson was invited to the stage. He adjusted the microphone once, glanced down at the folded page in his hand, and smiled out at the crowd with the tired affection of a man who had spent too many years in schools to believe much in polished speeches. "I've known today's honoree for 11 years, he began, and if I stood here and listed every reason he deserves this recognition, we'd miss dinner." The room laughed softly. "So, I'll tell you the truth instead. Some teachers cover material. Some teachers change the temperature of a building when they walk into it. Evan Carter is the second kind." Something in my chest tightened. Dawson went on to talk about debate practice after school, about students who stayed because they trusted room 214 more than whatever was waiting at home, about the way Evan noticed the kids who tried hardest to disappear. He mentioned improved test scores, almost as an afterthought. Character first, outcome second. Even that felt like Evan somehow. I looked toward my father then. Harold was sitting rigidly, both hands planted on his knees, not moving at all. Then Dawson said, "But I'm not the right person to tell you who this man is. The people who know best are the ones who sat in his classroom." A young man, in a navy suit, stepped onto the stage. He couldn't have been older than 27. Broad shoulders, clean haircut. The kind of controlled posture people learn when they've had to build themselves twice. He unfolded a page from inside his jacket and looked out at the audience, then toward Evan. "My name is Marcus Bell," he said, "and when I was 16, I was sleeping in my car." The room went so quiet it felt like a held breath. Marcus told them how he had shown up to school unwashed and exhausted because being there was still better than being nowhere. He said most adults noticed just enough to be uncomfortable, then looked away. But Mr. Carter had noticed enough to ask the right question, and gentle enough not to ask it in front of anybody else. He talked about early morning rides to school, waived exam fees, recommendation letters, one winter coat left on a chair with no note attached. "He never made me feel rescued," Marcus said, his voice catching for the first time. "He made me feel expected." I heard someone behind us sniff quietly. When I turned, my mother was already pressing a folded tissue to her mouth. Marcus looked down at his paper, then back up. "I'm in medical school now," he said. "People like to act like success starts when somebody works hard enough. Sometimes it starts when one person decides you're still worth showing up for before you've done anything to earn it." The applause rose fast and full, filling the auditorium from back to front. Noah started clapping too, hard and earnest, his whole body bouncing with it. "That's my dad," he whispered, loud enough for 3 people around us to smile. Before the sound had fully died, a second speaker came up. A young woman this time, dark hair pulled back, courtroom posture, maybe 30. "I'm Daniela Ruiz," she said. "Attorney. First-generation college graduate. Formerly the girl in third period who thought she was bad at everything." The audience laughed softly again, but she didn't. "Mr. Carter taught me that history was not just dates and wars and dead people," she said. "He taught me that every system in this country was built by choices, which meant it could be changed by choices too. That idea changed my life." She talked about debate tournaments Evan had driven them to in his own car, about him buying bagels at 6 in the morning because nobody argued while hungry, about staying after practice to coach kids whose parents were working late. She ended by turning toward him fully and saying, "A lot of people with money think influence comes from being obeyed. Mr. Carter taught me it comes from being trusted." That one landed like a strike of clean light. I didn't need to look at my father to feel it hit him, but I did anyway. Harold's jaw was locked so tight I could see the muscle jumping near his temple. He wasn't angry in the loud way. He looked cornered. Smaller somehow, like every sentence from that stage was taking away a version of himself he had counted on all his life. The version where he got to be the man who decided what worth looked like. On stage, the superintendent rose from her chair and returned to the podium. "And now," she said, smiling toward the front row, "please join me in welcoming Bibb County's Educator of the Year, Mr. Evan Carter." The room stood up all at once. It happened so fast it felt less like applause and more like weather. Chairs scraped back. Programs dropped into laps. Hands came together in one rolling wave that filled the auditorium from front to back until the whole place seemed to shake with it. Noah sprang to his feet beside me and clapped so hard his shoulders bounced. "That's my dad," he shouted. And this time, nobody smiled politely at the outburst. They laughed, warm and delighted, because they agreed with him. Evan stood slowly. For just a second, before he stepped toward the stage, he looked at me. Not dramatically, not with triumph, just one quiet look, steady and familiar, the same one he gave me across our kitchen table when the coffee had gone cold and the grating still wasn't done. But now it carried something else too. Not vindication, peace, the kind that comes when the truth finally arrives in a room before you have to drag it there yourself. He walked to the podium through a standing ovation my father could not stop, interrupt, or explain away. The superintendent handed him the plaque, shook his hand, and moved aside. Evan adjusted the microphone once, glanced out at the crowd, then down at the plaque in his hands like he still hadn't quite accepted it belonged to him. "I'm not very good at speeches," he said. That drew the soft laugh it was supposed to. But then the room settled again. "I teach middle school," he continued. "So, most days, if people are talking, it means I'm already losing." A few more laughs. Easier now. Then, his voice changed. Not bigger, not dramatic, just clearer. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how people measure worth," he said. "Some people use job titles, some use money, some use who gets listened to first in a room." He paused, and somewhere 3 rows behind us, my father went absolutely still. "But if you teach long enough, you learn something different. You learn that worth usually shows up quietly. It looks like the student who keeps coming back, even when life gives them every reason not to. It looks like trust. It looks like growth nobody claps for while it's happening." The auditorium was silent. "I'm grateful for this," he said, lifting the plaque slightly. "I really am. But the truth is, no teacher does this work alone. Not with students like these. I've just had the privilege of showing up for them while they did the hard part." Then, his eyes moved toward the rows where Marcus and Daniela were seated. "And if any of my students ever took one thing from my classroom, I hope it was this. Your value does not decrease because someone failed to recognize it." That did it. The applause came back harder than before. People rose again. Not everyone this time, because most of them were already standing. I turned without meaning to. My mother was crying openly now, tissue crushed in one hand. Harold was sitting beside her with his jaw locked and both hands flat on his knees, staring at the stage like he was watching a language he hated become fluent without his permission. Afterward, the lobby turned into a blur of handshakes, hugs, camera flashes, and people waiting for a word with Evan. Students came up one after another. Parents thanked him. A local reporter asked for a photo. Noah stood beside the plaque, like it had been won by the whole family. I was holding our coats when I saw my parents crossing the lobby. My mother reached Evan first. "Congratulations," she said, voice shaking. "That was beautiful." Evan nodded politely. "Thank you." Then Harold stepped forward. For one impossible second, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe humiliation had finally cracked something open in him that shame never could. Maybe he was about to do the one simple thing he had denied everyone for years. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Well." I felt the world narrow. Evan looked at him for a moment with a face so calm it was almost merciful. "You didn't ask," he said. "That was all. No lecture, no revenge, no raised voice. Just 4 words that stripped my father down to the truth of himself in the middle of a crowded lobby." Harold's face changed, not into remorse, into injury, into the expression of a man who still somehow believed he was the one being mistreated. He looked from Evan to me, then to the people moving around us, the cameras, the flowers, the students, the evidence of a life he had sneered at less than 24 hours earlier. Then he leaned toward my mother and muttered, not quietly enough, "Let's go." I thought that was the end. It wasn't. Rachel called me that night just after Noah fell asleep with the program from the ceremony folded under his pillow. Her voice was ragged. "Dad's furious," she said. "He's been on the phone for an hour." "With who?" "2 men from the church board. Somebody he knows at the district office. He keeps saying the ceremony turned into a spectacle and that Evan used those students to make a point." She took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "And he told Mom if you keep choosing your husband over this family, he'll rewrite everything. The house, the accounts, all of it." I stood in our dark kitchen, with one hand on the counter, and looked through the doorway at Evan, still in his white shirt, sitting beside our son's bed with the plaque on the dresser behind him. That was when the last illusion finally died. My father had just watched an entire auditorium rise to honor a good man, and his first instinct was still not remorse. It was revenge. Never let someone else's pride define your worth. And never stay at a table where love is offered without respect. Real value is not measured by money, status, or the loudest voice in the room, but by character, kindness, and the lives you touch when no one is watching. Sometimes, the hardest thing you will ever do is set a boundary with people you love, especially when they are family. But protecting your peace, your marriage, and your children from cruelty is not selfish. It is necessary. The people who truly deserve a place in your life are the ones who honor your dignity, not the ones who demand your silence. In the end, respect is not something you beg for. It is something you require.